the very best thing we can do is let beavers loose on the environment and let beavers beaver.
For everyone, all backgrounds, all ages, all genders, and all walks of life deserve an education. Come be one of us.
Everyone, welcome on in. We've got a very special guest on. Joining us today is Dr. Jordan Kennedy. She's going to be highlighting her breadth and depth and expertise of research onto all things, beavers, and she does not like this, but robot beavers. We're going to talk about some robot beavers. She's multidisciplinary quantitative researcher and engineer. So what does that mean? She combines both material science, mechanical engineering, biology of beavers, and ecology of complex systems. And that, yes, means fluid dynamics of how water flows, beaver-built dams, crash courses in ecological dynamics, and so much more. Jordan earned her PhD and master's in material science and mechanical engineering from Harvard, and brings serious field chops from designing the lab fume experience to piloting unmanned drones for photography and GIS mapping, which we're going to talk about then. Jordan has served as science director at the Indigenous LED, spearheading partnerships across federal, tribal, academic, and private research sectors, and have developed scientific frameworks rooted in Indigenous perspectives, emphasizing tribal IRB compliance and data sovereignty, which I think is really, really cool. The research spans from hydrodynamics of log jams to how North American beavers construct ecological structures using drones, photography, high-res mapping, and so much more. Jordan is committed to mentorship, inclusion, and has been multiple fellows and multiple award winnings in STEM initiatives as well. So Jordan, thank you so much for joining us today on the show. We are very, very excited to have you today.
Well, thank you for the invite. It's exciting to talk about beavers and robots.
but not
get there.
But not robot beavers.
I mean, there are robot beavers. There is a research group out of China that is quite literally making a robot, like a beaver robot. And mine is more beaver inspired than it is literal.
So we're going to get into these inspired beaver robots, but Jordan, can you take us back? How did you get involved in doing so very much different types of research that it's really, really unique insofar as you have the ecology, but you've got this like mechanical bioinformatics approach too, biophysics. What got you interested in science, I guess, and even originally to have such a big span of different things?
Well, I mean, originally I got into science because that's where the scholarships were, right? Like, I didn't want to go into debt for college, and there was a lot of scholarships available to me as a woman in engineering. And then when I got to college at Montana State for my undergrad degree in mechanical engineering, I discovered that the scholarships alone weren't enough to pay and eat off of. So I joined a research lab and I got paid to do research. And so I got a position in the chemical engineering department doing, looking at the mechanics of biopolymer gels. And so my education or my research training was initially looking at how polymers interact to give rise to macroscopic material properties. So basically how you can manipulate those to change behaviors within the broader material. And that I ended up getting my first publication off of that, not really knowing what I was doing. But I produced research that was novel enough that even as an undergrad, I got a first author publication. And then after I graduated with my bachelor's, I ended up doing an internship with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in a very similar type of experimental setting where I was looking at the mechanical properties of different materials. And one of the things I was looking at was the mechanical property of sticks, basically, where I was loading sticks up and trying to figure out a way to mechanically characterize it. And so this is really what got me thinking about beavers, oddly enough. And there was also ongoing work at the same time of one of my peers doing the biomechanics of birds' nests. And so in my mind, I thought, oh, that would be an interesting extension, was to look at the biomechanics of beaver dams.
So
And
Jordan,
so then
what
that's how I got into beavers.
when you're working with like you said the biomechanics of sticks, right? Just
Yeah.
like what and even and the biomechanics of like as working as an undergrad, what does that entail? So for like the party people at home, like how does one do these experiments? Like what does the lab look like? What is even the equipment that one uses to start to
To do
answer
that.
these questions?
Yeah, it's called a rheometer, and rheology is the science of how materials flow and how materials move. And it's a machine, and you put a material on it, and it oscillates like this, and it applies some external torque, and then the material resists it. And you can apply different frequencies, and you can tell how quickly materials relax. And you can get all sorts of material properties out of doing rheology. It's a very common thing when you're like thinking about like toothpaste or yogurt. Like all of that is engineered to have a specific consistency. And rheology is the way that you're able to measure that and define that. And when I was thinking about these piles of sticks, it was for the application of making biofuels. So pushing, how would I say it? Like trying to generalize the mechanical properties of these piles of sticks to get some approximation for when they're being processed into a biofuel, like a biofuel, how the mechanical measurement like is a predictor for how it's going to behave like on the conveyor.
That is mind-bogglingly cool. And it also makes total sense, like when you put it in the context of like toothpaste, we need to check as well, right? And these other components, but it's like, yeah, totally makes sense. You'd have to check the like the function of these sticks and how they would be going into these machines. It's just the pleasure of talking to someone who's done this. Like that doesn't seem like it's really your everyday kind of thing to be able to hear about. So how,
No,
how did
very specific.
how did that lead to identifying a beaver as being an animal to model this?
God. So in the hubris of youth and the enthusiasm of youth, I thought to myself, I'm going to mechanically characterize a beaver dam. Because I mean, from a mechanical standpoint, and a logistics standpoint, there's a lot of interesting things that we could learn from how to build a dam, none of which I've solved, by the way. But you have relatively mechanically robust structures made out of materials that are found locally within the environment. Like beavers are just building with what's there, and they're incredibly adaptive builders. One of my favorite stories when I was learning about beavers, I went and spoke to fur trappers. And one of my favorite stories was one of the guys who told me he went back to trap his beaver or check his beaver trap, and the trap was in the dam. Like the beaver just took it and stuck it in there. And like they famously build with sticks, muds, and rocks, but like, weird things like road signs, carcasses, really anything that's there, they'll put into their dams. And what they're able to do is build something very quickly with subpar materials that at the end of the day is quite mechanically robust. And so if you're thinking about applications of this, like quick building in disaster zones, that is an interesting and would be a very helpful um, adaptation to think about how can we build something very quickly to cope with a relatively extreme or sudden change within the environment.
Does it is it hard to model or even enter that question given how many different resources beavers use? Like would it presumably would have been easier if it was just one type of material, but the function of like
Yeah.
a sign or a body or the trap, which is that's a really cool
Oh
story.
yeah.
Presumably complicates it a lot more.
Oh yeah. There's going to be huge variation in in the mechanics of it. And again, I never got that far. Like because as soon as I got up in the air with my drone, I decided that wasn't an interesting question anymore. But yeah, there would be a tremendous amount of variation in the mechanics of it. And so what you do in science is you make a very hard problem a simple problem. And so you would reimagine a beaver dam design almost exclusively with simple sticks. Like the complexity gets absolutely insane. Like the more branches you have, the more material types you have. Like the amount of mechanical variability that these dams would have is significant. Not that I've measured it, but it's easy to extrapolate as to why that would be true.
You mentioned the drone. How,
Hmm.
when working with an animal that, isn't standard, right? Most people don't work with beavers. How
No,
how
no.
how like that shows a huge amount of creativity, right? To like identify how to start this kind of research question and even like just getting in like piloting the drone to do it. How did you plan out your research question? Because I that just seems really fascinating to me, especially when like you don't really have a plethora of papers to go to here.
I know I don't, but I've submitted a bunch, right? Like everything I've done, I've submitted. So, God, so by my own personal, so I don't. Looking back on it now, it feels insane. Like if I was my own advisor, I would have been like, "Don't do it, don't do it. That's insane." But like I said, it was the hubris of youth and the enthusiasm of being accepted and do like a prestigious PhD program, and I felt like I had something to prove. I mean, so I mean, there's the I suppose the ego part of it on one side, but like also just like naivete, like just this complete lack of understanding about how hard it was going to be. And it was hard. It was so hard in ways that I just didn't end up anticipating. Um, but my approach to it was yeah, so there was a lot. So I mean, as part of the PhD process, you kind of get immersed in this big intellectual community. And I think one of the first things that happened to me during my like the first year of my PhD, I just went to all these talks and everybody was working on all these very different and very interesting things. And I have a mind that I can jump between topics and I can find kind of cross-reference things and weave them together. And one of the bits of science that really captured my attention was the work on termites. And one of the things was that termites respond to airflow, and that's one of the environmental cues that helps them coordinate their building activities. And this builds on a much bigger framework of this concept called stigmergy. And stigmergy is basically using architecture as a form of language. And it's an idea that was developed for social insects, specifically macrotermes. I hope that's the right name, but how they're able to coordinate their building behavior despite being separated by space and generations, and like specifically building their termite mounds. So how are termites, and it takes multiple generations of termites to build, by the way, like many, many generations. And so the termite that starts the mound isn't going to be the termite that sees the mound come to completion. Like that, and so they have a huge logistics task, and beavers also share this, is how do you coordinate the building of structures despite being separated by space and generations? And so that got me thinking about this question as it applied to these social rodents. So I stepped out of the social insect sphere and applied that same framework to thinking about beavers. And the reason I thought that it would be an appropriate question to ask is because, one of my original plans was like I said, I was going to mechanically characterize these dams. And as part of that work, I was going to make 3D models of beaver dams. And so I learned about this method called photogrammetry because I had a lot of friends in archaeology and they were going out to field sites with their drones and they were making these incredible, basically digital twins of the environments they were studying of all these sites. And I was like, I can do that. Like it doesn't look that hard. It was hard. And then so I got this drone, I got my pilot's license, and I went out and I made like these, and I got up in the air and I looked down and I saw not a dam, but multiple dams and multiple ponds and canals and trails. So I thought I was just going to see a beaver dam, but I saw a beaver damming complex. And I thought this dam question is not really that interesting. This damming complex question is the interesting question. And so then I started thinking, how do they build? How do they coordinate? How do they distribute? How do they make the decisions to do this thing? Because a damming complex is massive. It's so big that when you're standing in one, you don't even know you're standing in one. It is, thousands of meters up and downstream of the lodge, a couple hundred meters wide. and takes many generations of beavers to build, and like colonies that aren't even related to each other. I mean, it's not just like coordinating in a colony, it's coordinating across colonies across time. And it's a massive undertaking. And so that to me became the question I was interested in, which meant that I had to completely change fields. And I
I
kind
can't
of
I
went
can't
into this.
imagine like the shock also. Like you said, you take the drone up, you're anticipating, right, there being a dam, and then all of
Mhm.
a sudden there's this whole complex of things that are built out. How do you start that pivot? Like how is that initial pivot started? Because that's gonna be like a fundamentally different question.
Um, it's a way different question. I like got into when I entered my PhD program, I got admitted into the material science and mechanical engineering program. And by the end of it, I was more in the like by the time it was said and done, I was firmly in the realm of I would say computer science, flirting with animal behavior, like flirting with robotics, like a massive switch. But I mean, that being said, like the things I learned in material science and rheology were still really helpful tools for me when I was thinking through these problems. They thinking, being trained in another field and then stepping into another one actually gives you like weird insights that nobody else trained in that field has. Not to
100%.
say that
Like
I didn't have to catch up.
yeah, but like the way that you're going to be looking at the problem is so fundamentally different from anyone else because your training is like, right, it's not that ecology background, but it's this material
No,
science, right? So it's like, wait a minute, you're gonna have a totally different thought process going on.
so different, so different.
So
Um,
so Jordan, you mentioned like,
yeah.
okay, you've taken the drone up. You see that
Hmm.
it's this whole complex, and you mentioned that it's not as easy as it sounds. Could you tell?
Oh, the drone mapping?
Yeah, could you just
Ah,
like because it's y'all, I've seen Jordan showed me some of these like images and how you can look in 3D space and basically zip around the map, and it is beautiful of what you can do. Why is something like that difficult? Is it the piloting? Is it just the angles of pictures? Is it all of it?
well, nobody taught me. So, I mean, there was a few things. So, I wouldn't say it's a fundamentally difficult task. I think most things in life, like the most difficult things in life, always come down to people. And so it was difficult in that I decided that was going to be my methodology, that I was going to map a beaver damming complex while it was being built. And we can get into like my logics about that. But so I decided to go over to the anthropology department and talk to like the anthropology professors, and they were just so condescending to me. They're like, "Oh, it's just going to be too hard for you to figure out. It's too complicated. The software is too hard." And I'm like, "What? Like I'm an engineer. Like some of the softwares I've had to use are just so opaque. What do you mean it's too hard?" And so I think a big part of it was so it was gatekeeping basically. So like these photogrammetry techniques, which at the time I was doing my PhD were kind of safeguarded by these people who were like finding their niche in the field. I think it's a lot more accessible now than it was, but like just how unwilling people were to teach me how to do it. And so I had to teach myself, right? I had to buy a book on drones and I had to read the papers. And it fundamentally isn't difficult. I think the fundamentally difficult part was like just trying to find somebody to teach me, figuring out that nobody was going to do it, and then having to teach myself. And it's not even that that's terribly difficult, but again, it's another field. So this is before, Chat GPT and you could just ask to get questions. So I'm sitting there on Wikipedia with these papers open next to me, like reading, like looking up terms and concepts on Wikipedia as I'm reading the papers. But no, it's not hard. It's just opaque and intentionally more like poorly worded, or like like academic speak, right? Just unnecessarily big words for what is fundamentally a very simple, straightforward thing.
I could imagine it would have been so much easier had someone just taken the time to help define like even saying like the terms, right? That in the papers are
Yeah.
just jargon and there's no definition in, but now it's like you need to have the technical side of drone flying and then you've got to have the program and presumably the angles imaged. Uh,
Yep.
one thing that
And,
you
and it's not hard. You just like get a drone and you point it straight down and you just fly in basically a grid pattern taking images. The images have to overlap. Theoretically, you need a minimum of 3 points. If you have a minimum of three images of 1 point from different angles, you can reconstruct it. And that's basically what I did. And there's all these photogrammetry softwares and algorithms that you can use to do it.
and so you mentioned, Jordan, why it would be interesting to get into this, like to analyze the dam that's being built. But before we answer that, could you talk to folks beyond just this being really interesting? Why does one want to study a beaver dam?
Uh, so really over biomimicry, I would say. I mean, I could say just to learn things for the sake of learning things and to appreciate the engineering of the non-human animal. But I mean, part of it, so at the time I was coming up, I was just absolutely fascinated by these groups of roboticists that were, making robots to build things. And I thought it would be, and again, this is naive. Like this is so naive, but like I thought it'd be pretty straightforward for like to have like a robotic unit use sticks to build something, right? There's just all sorts of reasons for like biomimicry. There's, animal cognition. There's even today, in the broader ecology and landscape restoration field, people make beaver dam analogs, BDAs, and they're quite literally trying to build beaver dams and streams to get the ecologic benefits that real beaver dams provide. This
It
biomimicry,
when they're
go ahead.
doing that, when they're doing that kind of biomimicry, like of this building of the dam, is it as the simple idea of here is this piece of wood that is the dam, or is it taking into account your idea of like all these inlets and like this ecosystem essentially that it's being built? It's not
No.
just that wall.
So I think the language around a beaver damming complex is a relatively recent thing within the broader beaver community, for lack of a better word, of beaver scientists and beaver practitioners and landscape managers. So when I was reading the literature about beavers, almost all the literature was on dams. And beavers don't just build dams. They actually build 7 discrete architectural elements that result in a damming complex, and the damming complex has a custom morphology that is at the interface of the environment itself and the behavior of the beaver, right? It's like a living architecture. It's a dynamic living architecture. And so they have canals, they have trails, they have dams, they have ponds, and the ponds aren't just like flooded by the dam. They actually excavate them to make them wider and deeper. And they also have underwater canal systems as well on the bottom of their ponds. Like they're constantly terraforming these things. They have food caches, they have scent mounds, and then they have the lodge slash burrow that they live in. And so 7 discrete architectural elements, and the final damming morphology has a tremendous amount of variability. And it seems to be very much driven, like it's honestly like the beavers are having a conversation with the environment, because like what arises are these structures that aren't necessarily easy to predict, but they facilitate flow, they facilitate nutrient transfer, all in very similar ways, but they are structurally very different things.
The variability is a fascinating part to me too, right? Like of all the different structures that you've named and like that they are building, it seems that a really, really difficult question then to ask, like that's your project, right? You get up in the drone and you see it's like all these extra variables at play. Given
But I didn't
how
understand that was my project.
Oh,
I
okay.
didn't
So can you take
when
us
I
from
looked
like
down, I didn't even have the insight to fully understand what I was seeing, which in part is probably why my PhD took 2 years longer than it would have otherwise, because the literature on it was all about the dams. But like the dams are super tiny. Like there were all these canals and trails, and then like these ponds that don't really, they're not just flooded river. Like they are actively, like they are structural things. There was lodges and there was scent mounds, like there, but I didn't understand it when I saw it initially. Like I was so focused on the dams. Like for the first 2 years of me, embarking on this mission, on this project, I was putting all this energy into the dams, and I was trying to make some statistical statement about the dams, and I couldn't. I just kept hitting dead ends. And I thought, what in the world am I doing? I just wasted a PhD to learn nothing. Like, what did I learn? And so then the real paradigm switch for me was when I started to actually think about the canals as architecture, because I didn't initially understand what I was looking at because there was barely any literature on it. And there's like maybe one paper on beaver trails, and those were such a key feature in my data set. Like yeah, I had to completely reframe about what I was thinking about the architecture and realize that the literature just wasn't there.
So, given that you also told us that it's multiple generations, right, that the
Yeah.
beavers are doing this, how did that reframing take place? Because that seems like, Jordan, that seems terrifying, right? That reframe, like
Yeah.
it's such a big question. How does one
Yeah, no,
do the
it broke my
reframe?
brain.
Yeah, no, it's it's breaking my brain too, as you're saying, like, and of
Yeah.
course, like then modeling the impact on the environment, right? It's like when that reset was done, what does that reset look like in terms of the research
Okay.
itself? Like, and like then what did you do, I guess, to move on?
Well, let's restructure how I did the study. So I decided to do my study on the Great Plains. And one of the reasons I decided to do the study on the Great Plains is there's two key things happening there. One, spring flooding washes out the dams every year, or almost every year. And so as part of that, I get to rewatch beavers rebuild their damming complexes from scratch, so to speak. And then another thing that the Great Plains provides that many of these other ecosystems don't provide is you can actually see what's going on. You can see what the beavers are doing on the ground. And I think this is one of the reasons trails aren't as reported on, is you have so much tree cover, you can't see the trails, you can't see the canals. But since I was working on the prairie, I got to see where beavers were going because, and I'm not talking like short grasses like we see in our lawns. Like I'm talking grasses that are probably up to my chest. Like these are true grasslands and, kind of the American savanna. And even though it's a grass, beavers can't see, like one, they have poor eyesight, but even when you're standing in these beaver damming, like next to a beaver pond, you can't see. Like humans have excellent eyesight. We have excellent vision. And I couldn't really distinguish it. And there's no way a beaver is spatially something that, is close to the ground, heads low to the ground. They're not seeing very far. And so, but because it was a grassland, they were clearing these trails, like they were clearing the grass away from these trails. And so I could watch these trails be built in real time, right? So the spring flooding, I took my drones and I went and I made maps of beaver damming complexes approximately once a week. I had 20 beaver colonies in this data set, and I just watched them build all summer long. I would wake up at 5 a.m., I'd get to the field site, and I'd make a map. And I did this every week for 3 months. And yeah, I watched them build in real time. And one of the most prolific features in my data set and most dynamic features in my data set were these trail systems that were not in the literature. And like, not only did I not know how to interpret them, I didn't even realize the beavers were making them initially. Like,
And what was the like? Was it just that you saw like in the drone that there was these extra trails that are being formed over time and being modified? Was that like I guess how does one, when it's never described in the literature, like
uh,
how do you take that and like now it's like, oh, this is an independent structure that is now being generated? Does that make sense? Like you're the
yeah.
pioneer, like observing
So
it for the first time.
I had to imagine what it would be like if I was a beaver. Because, I mean, fundamentally, beavers have a really and more in like the not in less the global sense, but more in like the local sense, they have a real challenge of they have to figure out where to source their building materials. It's not even just, oh, I'm going to build a dam, right? The dam is or a lodge or a food cache. That's kind of the end product. Before any of that happens, the very first thing they have to do is find and harvest materials. And these trails always, and I mean always, preceded dam building without exception. And so that for me, when I started to look at them seriously, that was the first clue. Like I can't prove to you that the beavers built anything in this data set. I can't prove to you they built the dams. I can't prove to you they built the trails or the lodge. Like I can't make any, because one of the questions I got, well, how do you know those are beavers and those and not like, just cows or deer walking along the waterway? And there was a few structural differences with them. One, they always come from the stream. If you've ever like worked with large ungulates like cows or deer, they do edge following, so they would have walked parallel to the stream. And so the trails weren't doing that. They were always perpendicular to the bank, and then they would go out. And then the most telling sign is at the end of these trails, they'd take down trees and then pull them back.
Presumably, that's not a deer,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah, deer. Yeah, not doing that.
that's all. Just as a side note, how interesting is that? That like, because right, as a material scientist, that's never the review questions that you're gonna get, right? On those initial
Yeah.
papers that you did as an undergrad, right? Of like, how do you know that's a beaver? Like, that's just a wild reviewer question. It's like, yeah, I get it, but like, wow, that's a very fascinating question.
Well, and like to this point, like I'm describing all these things to you. I've submitted this paper several times and I keep getting it rejected because they're like, you can't prove beavers built that. And I'm like, I know I can't. They're like, why didn't you put camera traps out there? I'm like, it's literally kilometers of stream. I don't know. Like, so I'm telling you all of this on a paper that keeps getting rejected because I can't prove the very thing I'm telling you, right? I'm making these inferences based on context. Why do I think that beavers did that? Well, that tree is now in the dam. But no, I can't prove that the beavers were on that trail. I don't have, any images of the beavers being on that trail.
I think it might also be, it's like new concepts, right? And new concepts always seem to be disliked just because they're new, which is quite
Yeah,
unfortunate.
yeah.
We had a question from the chat, Jordan, if there was any pattern like on these trails for like hardwoods or softwoods, or was that something that you had to integrate into your model?
So I didn't look at what trees they were taking down. So it's the Great Plains. It was pretty limited to ash or willow that they were pulling, but they were also the grasses that they were clearing, they were also putting in their dams. No, I wasn't really looking at like the trees that they were taking specifically. And then in terms of patterns, I know this isn't the question that was asked, but the morphology of the trails had a really interesting pattern. It has a like kind of dendritic, like it looks like trees, like it's this trail system and it branches. Like it has all of these branches that go off of it, and some of the branches die off, and then some of them get reinforced, and so it looks like a neuron. These trail systems look like what you would expect a neuron to look like. It's which that's another thing. Anyway, we can bring up the neurons again when I start talking about the simulation. But no, I wasn't modeling any type of vegetation.
When seeing like all these different branching points and you're like modeling out what's going on, how do
Mhm.
you how do you decide what is the next step in the research question as well? Because that's again what I think is really, really cool is like your different background, right? So maybe those anthropologists thought that was a hindrance. I for one, that's what I find the coolest, right? That you're totally different background coming in there, and the way you design these research questions are different. So now you have this video, you've got the 3D images, you've started to do the modeling. Where do you move as your next step? Like, how do you define like what
Okay.
that next question could be? Because there's just so much there that you can answer.
There's a lot. And that's actually another thing I got back from reviewers is like, this is a massive data set that's underutilized. I'm like, yeah, I know, but that's not the story I'm trying to tell. Okay. Like it's such the data set I was able to generate was incredibly rich. There's no question about it. Like, so I looked at these damming complexes after spring flooding as they were being built on a weekly time scale, looking at the evolution of trails, looking at the evolution of dams, looking at, where the lodge was, and looking at where the canals were. I spent 2 years putting all my energies into the dams to find nothing. I can't, like, I don't know what else there's to say about that. Like, I wasted a lot of time being wrong because my hypothesis going into this was that beavers are able to coordinate their building behaviors through where they leave their dams behind in the environment. And one of the issues with that, especially at my field sites, is the dams fail every year. There's nothing left to coordinate any type of building material, like any. And so like I was thinking, oh, maybe it's the remnants of the dams. Couldn't find anything meaningful there at all. And so the paradigm shift came when I started looking at the canals. So one of the things that I noticed on some of these trail systems is that the really productive trail systems right at the beginning, so right where the river and the trail was going off, would start to turn into these canals. They start off as beaver slides, so you can see where they're sliding into the water. But if it was really productive, it got a little bit longer. And so then I started looking at the satellite imagery of my field sites, and I noticed that a lot of these canal systems kind of had this, I guess, oscillating type of behavior that tended towards larger and larger and larger every year. So what happened is like it would like oscillate like this, like a beaver colony would expand and then it would contract and it would expand, but this time it was a little bit bigger, and then it would contract and then it would expand and it would contract. And so what I think the canals are doing, and again, this is a hypothesis, but this is the hypothesis that's leading my current work with robotics, is that the canals that they embed into the environment are the result of productive trail systems. So if a trail system is productive, it gets reinforced into a canal. And if you're a beaver and you're trying to make a decision about where to build you're like set up for your next colony, and remember, you're a beaver, you can't see very well. You are navigating a massive environment, and even though you're the largest rodent in North America, you're maybe at best 50 pounds. Like you are a small being in a very big landscape. And so one of the ways that beavers are able to assess the fitness of a site for colonization is by the evidence of previous beaver colonies in that area. Now, I don't know if they're responding specifically to the canal, although I think that they are, right? Because I don't know what a beaver's thinking. I can't get in their head. Or if the canals change the hydrodynamics of the area in such a way that they're like, yeah, this is a vibe. I don't know exactly what they're doing, but what I do know is that these canal systems slowly get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. These structures are ramified. So very productive beaver habitats have extensive canal networks, and they get so extensive they start to interconnect. So you don't even just have this simple river, you have these canal systems that are crisscrossing the environment and connecting to each other, and they're extremely stable. So if you have a big spring flood coming through, the areas that have all these canals, the dams aren't going to fail because the water is going to be rerouted through these canals. It's relieving the hydraulic stress on the dams. And so that's just from like a dynamic standpoint. But these canals on the landscape, if you're a beaver and you have to make a decision and you're heavily predated upon because there's bears, there's wolves, there's coyotes, and you are a fantastic meal, you have to make a decision based on what's locally there, right? You just have to make a good enough decision, not an optimized one. And so the good enough decision, oh, there's a canal there. This was productive in the past for another beaver colony. I'm going to set up shop here. And so I think these canals are a way that they're able to communicate across space and time to other generations of beavers. And the more productive a canal is, it'll get ramified again. And then when they eat up all the trees, because they will, they'll abandon the site and try to find a new one. And while it's abandoned, this wider wetland now, because the canals have widened the wetland, are redistributing nutrients further along the stream, redistributing water further around the stream. Now, not only do you have a bigger aquatic area, you have more vegetation. It's like they're farming in a kind of very cyclic way. And so then they'll come back in, they'll recolonize it again, they'll take down all the trees again, and then there won't be anything left, and they'll abandon it. And while it's abandoned, all the trees grow up, but there's more this time. And so they exist on these cycles. And so that's why you get to see this expansion and this contraction, but it keeps tending bigger and bigger and bigger over the many decades that we have satellite data available to look at these sites. And so I think that's the mechanism of coordination and indirect communication, and that these canals are basically long-term memories embedded into the landscape of formerly productive areas.
So they're actually, and it's also all the more like they are in fact terraforming, right? The entire ecosystem, where it's not only beneficial going to be for them, right, with these inlets and like building more and more with the more wood coming in, but presumably all the wildlife in the area is going to be differentially
Hmm.
affected with the increased vegetation or the spread of further types of vegetation. It's
Yeah.
it's really interesting how that can signal for them to go back in the future too. Like I really think that multi-generational communication is really, really cool and really exciting.
So that's like where I've arrived with what I think they're doing. Like I and again, this is all a hypothesis, but those are the only structures they continually like ramify. Yeah.
We had a question from the chat, Jordan, of have you had a
Yeah.
chance to compare between environments, the ones that need to be rebuilt each year and the ones that don't? Wondering if there's any difference in the canals and if there is a stopping point for the building.
Wow, that's a very insightful question. Yes. So there was two types of beaver colonies in my data set, the ones that their dams washed out, and then there was the other damming complexes that the dams were very stable, and the difference between the two was the presence, or not the presence, but I guess the maturity of the canals. So these damming complexes in which the dams did not fail had very interconnected, very long, and what I mean by long is like 400-meter in length canals, like just massive canaling going on. And those were very hydrodynamically stable for the beaver colonies. But then the colonies that had to rebuild, a consistent feature was if they had any canals, they were these itty bitty things. Like they weren't very big yet.
So is it fair to say that eventually, with reinforcement over multiple seasons, it would have turned into one of those like more reliable, canals,
Yeah.
and therefore they probably wouldn't have had the same flooding issue as before?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And one of the reasons it hasn't, like, I mean, let's just say since the fur trade, right? We've been very aggressively taking beavers out of our watersheds throughout North America. And beavers are making a massive comeback. And so our landscapes now, even though beavers are returning to them in mass, is more defined by their absence than their presence. And so now they're coming back into these landscapes and they're engineering these landscapes once again. And people see what they're doing and they're like, that beaver's ruining my stream. They turned that stream into a swamp and it's terrible. And this is not how the stream is supposed to be. I mean, that's like a form of ecologic, like amnesia, right? It's like this forgetting because it takes so many generations for beavers to build that as they're building, we don't really understand it, right? Like when people say, "Oh, the beaver came in and it take down all my trees and it killed everything and it's a pest," like they're right. It did come in and it took down all the trees. But if you wait another 5 years, all those trees are going to come back fuller, right? Like we don't humans just we have this real everybody does, right? We see things in real time. We're not able to like recognize our role and like the bigger ecologic narrative, and these ecologic narratives happen on cycles of years or decades or centuries, right? And we can't see that in real time.
Sounds similar to those reviewers, Jordan.
Yeah, I
uh,
know.
a question from the chat is so building upon the knowledge left behind by past generations, eventually the control, the cycle, yearly floods in that area. Is that the idea of it? And I guess with that question is maybe we can pivot of how this links to your work in robotics.
Yeah, well, but that's a nice question. So like why build like a beaver, right? So
Yeah.
that's one of the questions, is why would you look at this from an engineering point of view? Even my dad, when I was like studying this, he was like, why in the world would you waste your PhD engineering degree on studying that? He's like, nobody's ever going to hire you. And guess what, Dad? I'm hired. But anyway, to this point, so I was interested in looking at the engineering of beaver, and like again I started with dams, and like there are biomimicry of beaver dam analogs where people are quite literally putting fake beaver dams in degraded streams and trying to get that stream back. They're trying to get life back into that stream, and we're not very good at it. Beavers do a much better job than we can do. But the damming complexes that I saw had an interesting feature where they're both resistant to flooding and they're both resistant to drought and they're resistant to fire. So Emily Fairfax's work, I mean, she's right now probably the leading researcher in beavers, and a lot of her work was based on beaver and fire. And these areas in the in like in the Rocky Mountain West, the only places that don't burn are where there's beavers. And then in my data sets, so the Great Plains is basically a high desert. I mean, so you get really limited rainfall like once a year. So you got spring flooding and you got a little bit of rain in the spring, and then you get this massive influx of water. And so, and it can be rather destructive on these simple streams. But the areas that had these complex beaver damming, like with all these canals and like this full infrastructure, those areas didn't flood because the water had somewhere to go. Like it went into all of these different canals. And so you have this landscape structure that copes well with high flow events. And then later in the summer, again, it's basically high desert, we're lacking water, and the only areas that had sufficient water were these areas that were like both in area and depth were these areas with canals. Because they spread out the water, they stored the water deeper, so it was cooler. And so, yeah, it's an interesting architecture when you're thinking about how can I design this waterway or this landscape to cope with what are two relatively extreme things. And so I got hired by the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University by Professor Karen Lee Bar-Sinai. And she is pioneering the field of landscape robotics. And this is, you know, generally like she's had other robotic flags, like worked on other robotic systems before. So I started talking with her and she hired me on to start building out this multi-agent robotic framework to think about how to engineer degraded wetlands or like intercoastal zones that are like, you know, really threatened by sea level rise and just humans generally. And how can we make these more robust? How can we cope with more extreme flow events? And so we started thinking about this canal issue. And so as part of this work, I am working with a computer scientist named Federico Olivia. And he has coded, and I co-designed it, a multi-agent simulation based on how we think beavers build, based on my thesis work, where they're able to coordinate this building based on the canals that they leave behind in the environment. And we are using that and applying it to drone scans of real landscapes. We're deploying this multi-agent simulation to imagine how beavers would have engineered that landscape if they were there for 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, right, to go through all these cycles. And then using the outputs of that simulation to inform landscape restoration in these overly degraded areas.
Is it fair to say that in some of these areas there wouldn't naturally be beavers, so you're just using the principles learned from beaver like architecture and water runoff in order for this to save that current ecosystem or to, better that
You
ecosystem?
know, like if you'd asked me this question even just 1 year ago, I'd be like, beavers don't belong in intertidal zones. And now there's all this work showing beavers are recolonizing these areas. Like, yeah. So beavers do, there is an ecologic precedent for having beavers exist in intercoastal brackish salt water. So I think they would have naturally lived in those places. Again, ecologic amnesia. I have it too. I had no idea, right? I'm like, oh, how about that? There's beavers in there. Wasn't expecting it, but there's not beavers in some of the sites we're looking at now. And then also some of these sites are just profoundly polluted, and I like so profoundly polluted. There's no beaver that's coming back. Like, they're just not doing it. So when we're talking about deploying, like the very best thing, and I sit like 10 toes down with my full chest, the very best thing we can do is partner with beavers directly. The very best thing we can do is let beavers loose on the environment and let beavers beaver. But, there's some areas in which it's just not going to happen because they're so degraded or they're so polluted, right? So there's two approaches here. One is prepping these landscapes for beaver recolonization using robotic tooling.
What,
We
George,
want,
what,
this
what goes into the prepping? So, like, how How, I guess, is it that you're trying to prime a landscape in a certain way to let them loose? And if so, what does that entail? Like, how do we get a location ready, independent of pollution cleanup, which just sounds like some place that are too far gone?
Well, I mean, so to do that, I mean, so that's another form. This gets back to the dams. We're like, well, there's a lot of pollution. What if we put in these dam-like structures that filter out the water? Yeah, let's do that. So, like, that's another project that a different student is working on, right? So, like, there is the BDA mimicry, but less so much with like the sticks, like, but more like with intentional materials that are designed to filter out certain chemicals and pesticides and things, right? They're kind of like beaver inspired without being, yeah, they're like materially advanced BDAs, right? Like putting in like, cause yeah, anyway. But prepping the landscape is making these canal systems to mitigate flow regimes. Like it's like, so when a beaver moves into an area, they, all right, so I'm gonna take a step back. Just me take a step back. So even though there's this adage, as busy as a beaver, we know that beavers don't build if they don't have to. So because we nearly drove this species to extinction, we actually have an insight for like what habitats they prefer to be in. And so they'll go to sufficiently deep ponds and slow flowing like rivers and those lakes, like areas where they don't have to build. That's the very first place they're going to go, and that's where they're going to hang out. But soon, but these areas do reach carrying capacity at some point. And so once these areas reach carrying capacity, beavers have to move into subpar environments. And when they go into these subpar environments, they have to engineer those environments to meet the life cycle colony needs, which is I want a deep, slow moving pond. That's what they want. And so when we are thinking about these landscape interventions, there's two questions. Can we prep this landscape in such a way that beavers will move in? Can we nucleate a colony here that's happy and stable? And then from that, they'll start to move out. And from that initial nucleation point, beavers will start building from that. And this is what we've seen like in Acadia and a lot of these other national parks where beavers are making a comeback. The other bit of it is can we apply this to landscapes where there's no beavers at all? Like I'm thinking like terrestrial desert scapes, for instance, right? So can we design, because like this is a theoretical framework. It's not just designing for water, it's the principles of designing at the interface of environment and builder. And so can we build to the landscape such that we are taking in the information from the sun? Like, can we, or like, we're anticipating airflow, like some environmental parameter that is going to be bespoke to environment, right? What emerges is going to be a custom structure globally, but is locally going to consist of like these discrete architectural elements. And so, like, if I want to build to slope, if I want to build to the direction of water in that environment, so applying these to things like desert scapes or even, if you want to go way out there, astronauts building things in a Martian scape, who knows, right? It's just this, can we build to the constraints of the environment instead of prescribing a design? And I feel crazy. Like this all sounds insane even to me oftentimes, but like that's what we're thinking about. Like, why would we want to build like a beaver? And part of it is, can we build to the environment such that we can promote flow of materials and we don't disrupt, like, can we build in such a way that we don't end up killing everything?
And
We haven't
bringing
really mastered that.
no, no, and bringing new life to an area too. Like,
Yeah.
like I get why you're saying, Jordan, it sounds a little bit crazy, but it sounds crazy cool, right? I mean, you're just taking principles from nature that is being done by these animals naturally, right? And you're just
Yeah.
learning what those rules are and then applying it to a new area.
Yeah, and it's so counter to how humans have historically built, because we kind of build things to last forever, and that's really hurting us. Like, as a species, we're having a hell of a time with that one. And these beaver damming complexes are dynamic, like they're almost alive. Like when the more, and I sound crazy because the more I look at it, the more I'm convinced it's a living system. Because there's just so much happening, and it's amorphous and it's expanding and it's contracting, and it's like it's like they're in constant conversation with the landscape. I don't know how, like, it's just this.
it reminds me of like actually to harken back to your termite comment, right? A super organism, right?
Yeah,
There's like
yeah,
the maybe the basic dam that you were expecting to look at is like the heart, but then there's all these nerves and arteries and veins, which are all the inlets and canals, and it's like all working together, and you can't
yeah,
break one
yeah,
away and not have it be functional. I don't know, it
yeah,
makes total sense to me because then you factor in the environment, like you said, and how it's spreading the canal, which is causing more vegetation, which is causing further spread. Like
yeah.
is such
No,
a
it just
cool system. It's so
it
cool.
is. It's, and so when it comes to like the hydrodynamic modeling, so two things. We're taking my drone scans, which are accurate from a topographic perspective, and we're just modeling different flows to these areas with beavers and without beavers, and to understand hydrodynamically what that looks like, what's happening, right? Just as a first order, like to make the engineering case for why design like a beaver. Well, if you run flow through it, this is what happens, right? That's the first question. And then with these multi-agent simulations, to run the same hydrodynamic model on this beaver re-inspired landscape to see hydrodynamically what's happening to it if we did that.
And you mentioned, I guess we talked a little bit about like the beavers and where maybe they wouldn't normally be in brackish water, we would have assumed, right? But now we know it's like, oh no, they
Oh,
would all of a sudden be here. When you and
oh
I
yeah, it's wild. I had no idea.
But when you and I had talked like off stream and we kind of talking about you coming on, you mentioned that there was this immensely beautiful connection to indigenous history and being able to utilize
Yeah,
that history to learn where the beavers used to be and like where we could do this terraforming too. Would you mind talking a little bit about that side of the research too? Because it just, Jordan,
yeah.
you pull together so much cool stuff that I just want to highlight to the community like how incredible this research is.
Yeah, so I work a lot with tribes, and I don't know how that happened, but anyway, I do. So I do a lot of tribal work. And I mean, there's a few things. Like one of the frameworks with my research is I do try to embody the psychology of beavers, which really harkens back to this kin empathy framework that a lot of indigenous nations have. And so when you talk to tribal nations like that, like they vibe with it, right? Like, yeah, you know, you get it. Like this, yeah, this is our relation. This is, you know, one of our major partners on the landscape. And so so I just submitted a paper, and who knows if it'll get accepted. I called it Beaver Futurism, how partnering with beavers is a way to reclaim tribal sovereignty. And because how closely beavers connect to foodways and practices on the landscape. So one of the ways I learned about intertidal beavers was the work being done in Oregon about beavers quite literally in these intertidal zones. And when beavers moved into those areas, the juvenile salmon population exploded. And so basically what was happening is beavers are building in these intertidal streams, and they have their dams, and then the tide comes up, the dams get covered, and all the fish come in. And when the tide goes back out, all these fish have these little micro ponds they get to hang out in. And when they're in these micro ponds, they're not exposed to the big predators out in the ocean. So like they have this like protected spot during low tide that increases their survivability. And so if you are a West Coast native, you like your salmon. Like, you know, so like, you know, so this beaver is tied directly back into that food system. Another example of this would be like the Pueblo Indians who used to plant their corn near dams. And when they needed some water, they would just break the dam a little bit, and water would run in from the beaver dam, and they'd water their corn that way, right? So that's another partnership there. Or the Great Plains. So one of the things I noticed about where I did my studies is a lot of these areas wouldn't have water if they didn't have beaver. I actually was talking to some of the ranchers in the area, because this was like before I did my field work, because I was looking for field sites, and one of the ranchers wasn't gonna. He was like, "What are you gonna do to those beavers? Are you gonna trap them?" I'm like, "No, I just want to see what they build." And he was like, "Well," he's like, "if I didn't have any beavers on this property, I wouldn't have any water." And he's like, "I'm not gonna let anybody go down there and hurt those beavers because I need to like water my cows." And so there's this really important traditional relationship between beaver and bison. And so if you were to talk to like some Blackfeet, they would tell you that the beaver and bison are brothers, right? Which sounds crazy, but then it comes out of this like relationship that if you didn't have beavers on the landscape, you wouldn't have water, and if you didn't have water on the landscape, you wouldn't have buffalo, and if you didn't have either, you were going to die, right? Like and like to such a degree that the Blackfeet tribe in particular refused to hunt beavers. Like they just like very few members of the Blackfeet tribe engaged in the fur trade because they were such a highly esteemed animal, and that connection to the water on the landscape was so important, right? So like they are tied to these foodways, and they're making comebacks in these intertidal zones. We don't really know much about it. I also learned that beavers and alligators live in the same habitat. If you would have asked me that a year ago, I'd be like, no way. There's no way that beavers and alligators live in the same waterways, but they 100% do. So even I'm
Under
learning.
threat of being eaten, or just like they're chill with one another.
Oh, they're definitely predated upon
Okay.
by alligators, 100%. But they still occupy the same ecosystems.
That's
Which blew my mind.
yeah. That I would not have. I don't think
Yeah,
I've
me
seen a
neither.
single nature documentary that ever even suggested such a thing. Like just in the general knowledge of the population, you never see those two animals side by side.
Yeah. And like a year ago, I would have confidently told you not happening. But no, one of my potential collaborators down in Mississippi, she's like, yeah, they're definitely hanging out together. I was like, all right, I believe you.
The chat Jordan is blowing up with just how cool this is, right? Like creating that symbiotic tree of life of beaver, salmon, bison, corn, person. Like it's remarkable what
Oh, and potatoes.
bro. That is it. The same principle, like breaking the dam to allow it to water.
No, actually, so this was the Coeur d'Alene tribe, I believe. I hope I'm right. I don't want to give the wrong tribe. So they like reintroduced a bunch of beavers onto their property, and then suddenly their extinct potato came back in one of the beaver damming complexes. And
So
so then they were able to re-harvest this potato that
wow.
was quote unquote extinct because like the beavers came back and this landscape enabled it.
So is it? I guess it was extinct that we thought it was extinct, and there had been some seeds or something dispersed,
Yeah,
and it just
yeah, we thought it
that
was extinct.
Jordan. That's crazy cool.
I know. That's crazy. That blew my mind. Like, yeah, they're bringing back food.
Wow. Um, it's mind-bogglingly cool. Like how you started as an undergrad in material science with your first author paper to now working on like restoring ecosystems with native tribes, with building robotic. Like it is
I know,
really
it's
really
weird.
incredible, Jordan. Like I just the chat there,
It's
everyone's like
weird.
people are just like whoa. Like those are the kind of the comments coming in of like how incredible that is. Um, what has been, you mentioned that there was like a lot of difficulty along the way in terms of the learning side of things. Do you are you the one like building the robots or programming the robots? Like where are you going currently with respect to the direction of the research? Because there's so many ways to
So
go,
I
right?
thought, yeah, I know. So I thought when I started the postdoc, that's exactly what I would be doing. But then, like, what's happened is all these masters and undergrads have just started building it for me. I was like, all right, cool. Like, I'm not going to get in your way. I was like, yeah, by all means, man, go build that excavator. So I have one student. Well, I have 4 students. Okay. Do you want me to run through the list of what my students are doing?
If you have the time, we would love to.
So I have one student who's collecting indigenous narratives on beavers and then is like mapping them onto the landscape based on where the original story was from.
So
And like,
how does that work? Right? Because that
so like,
that just seems
uh,
complex, difficult.
I like I'm just making her do a literature review, sending to the library, academic papers, Google Scholar, tribal websites, tribal like storybooks, like just whatever literature we can find, anthropologic papers, oddly enough, like just whatever literature we can find about beaver as I don't want to call it mythologies, but like so the word I'm going to use to be politically correct is the original teachings of tribes, right? These are basically instructions. So they don't view them as mythologies, but they also don't view them as literal things. They view these as instructions for how to live in a good relation with the rest of all the other beings, right? And so
So
a lot of these stories that
does that mean,
go ahead.
like you were saying, like it was literature review? So does that mean that you don't have to do like the original interviews to get the stories from the tribes? That there's documentation of said stories in like
No,
online
so I mean,
repositories?
so that's absolutely 100% within scope, but you still need to do the literature review because I'm not going to send a student out to interview somebody without having them read the literature. Like, so no, I'm not at the phase yet where I'm interviewing elders. Also, the moment that you start interviewing people, you have to submit like IRB, as you rightly should, by the way. Like, this isn't like it's a pain, but it's very necessary to submit tribal IRBs to get the research permissions to do the work that you're going to do. And that's the right way to do it and how it should be done. But right now we are in the phase of this study where we're just reading publicly available books, like things you can get in the library, things you can get off of Google Scholar, to get an idea of what questions that we would want to ask when we get to the interview stage.
So it's in the plan works. It's just you're prepping all the background knowledge to be able to know what
Yeah.
questions to ask instead of going in blind, essentially.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, like
Nice.
what are the stories? Like how do they map on the landscapes? What are common themes? Like basically doing a literary analysis, but instead of like maybe pulling out like themes for specific stories, mapping the themes to place.
So
Like
you want to basically have a map and like
yeah,
outline beaver domains or
stories.
regions where they had populated and what they did, right? On
Yeah.
this
I
map.
mean,
Yeah.
yeah, so when you get like up in the Great Lakes region and over onto the Northwest, you get a lot of giant beaver stories. Oddly enough, when you get to the Rocky Mountain West, you get a lot of stories about beaver and fire. Or and then, there's a lot of, like, especially where the glacial tilts, like the glacial lines were, you get a lot of stories about the earth diver narrative, where the beaver was one of the original animals that would dive down and bring dirt up to help build the world. Like they're part of the creation stories of a lot of different tribes. And so my very, very loose hypothesis with this work is that landscapes inform story, and that these stories as like kind of moral teachings will tell you something about the ecology of that landscape. It's a very, very loose hypothesis, and we'll see what we get. Worst case, we'll have a cool map of stories. Best case, we can make some statement about like, how landscapes inform narratives. I honestly have no idea how it's going to look when it's done, but that's one of the projects. I have
Speaking of,
another. Go ahead.
just we had one question kind of spawn off that idea of like, landscapes informing narratives, but also I guess historical
Yeah.
events too. Is there any evidence to suggest that the Dust Bowl, for example, could have been the start of a lack of beaver?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean, you took beaver at that land. I mean, there was a lot of things that went wrong. There was so much that went wrong for that to happen. So it wasn't just beavers not being there, but like beavers would have helped. They would have helped massively had they been there.
So as even almost prophylactic or preventative medicine, we could be using beaver
Yeah.
architecture for ecosystems.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Like it's brilliant what they do. And like they're brilliant in a way that even like I don't think any of us really understand because we can't emulate it. Like there's no engineering quite like it
Yeah, it's
that humans have done anyway.
not yet. You're working on it.
Well, I do not think that whatever I build is actually going to compete with a real beaver, and that's not really my goal. I think the very best thing to do is to partner with beavers directly. But I am looking at this for applications in other landscapes, design principles, but also prepping landscapes for possible beaver reintroduction.
I think the quote that everyone has been latching on to that say if you don't have a merch website, you need it is let beavers be beavers.
Yeah, yeah.
There
Let
was-
beavers beaver.
All right, so first project is this storytelling linking to the landscape. What's the second one?
Yep. The second project is I have a master student who is quite literally building the hydrodynamic models based on drone scans of habitats. And he's just looking at, I say just, it's a lot of work. He is looking at the way that flow moves through these beaver engineered systems versus systems without beaver, right? He's making the case. for why we would want to build like a beaver. The third student is building. He's building an AI model, a regional convolutional neural network to so it's a hard problem. It's a very hard problem, but basically to map or like to make traces of beaver architecture. But like as I told you, like these architectures are amorphous. They're incredibly unpredictable. Like the AI we have isn't that great. That we've built is it does okay, I suppose, but it has a hard time looking at all of these individual structures and then identifying the whole thing as a damming complex. Like it's because what emerges is so different based on habitat type. And anyway, so we're building a convolutional neural network for that. And then I feel like I'm missing one student and I don't want to and then I have another student who is building the excavator mechanism for the beaver bot.
So for the flow measurements with the
Mhm.
second project, does that involve going into beaver territory and measuring directly the flow rate, or is that something that you can get using the drone technology?
No, I was in the stream taking flow measurements.
Okay, so your original data set, you were in the water in addition to
Yeah,
drone. Okay,
yeah.
that again, like
I
I
was
guess you're
droning, and then I get in the water with a flow stick and take measurements. Yeah, I did it.
nice.
I did
And
it.
then
Yeah.
for the AI study, like where you're trying to model it,
Mhm.
what do you choose as the data that's going in? Like, how do you identify
All
what
my
needs to
drone
be
data.
added? It's just so like partitioning it like this is inlet, this is canal, this is base, and like
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Because I mean, for my PhD work, oh my God, it's a little traumatic thinking about because it was during the pandemic, but I just traced all my maps in ArcGIS like manually. Oh, so painful. So anyway, I gave him this fully annotated data set that had the canals and ponds and dams and lodges and like use that as the training set. Uh, and hopefully being able to apply that to satellite imagery to like identify different damming morphologies.
nice, nice. And then now you're applying that to new data sets, and you've trained the model based on all your hand collected data, so you know that's correct. Then it's
Yeah.
just, I guess it's just figuring out right how to incorporate those connections into the model to make it as accurate as possible.
Yeah, and it's hard. Like it's like I don't want to get into the technical details of like every way we've failed, but we failed a lot. And we knew it was going to be hard. Like AI is good, but there's some things that it's not that good at yet.
Is a follow-up question we've got for you, Jordan, is in reintroducing or introducing beavers or the excavator, robot mechanism, how does one account for the natural flow of the waterway in where the beavers are going to be building? So I guess like you're going to presumably alter things in a way, and how does the model take into account what's naturally there?
We reinforce it with real data. Like we just like so the site, the degraded site we're redesigning is it's a conservation site in Boston. And there's a lot of researchers there just collecting data typically. So we just take the data that they have and we like say this is what we anticipate the volumetric flow rate to be, and we see what happens. I hope I answered the question. I'm not sure if I did.
Yeah, and does that mean that when you're doing this reintroduction at a particular site, does each site get its own like set of measurements? Like, are you going to be testing out each site before you do the
I
introduction,
know.
or it's like you have a base model elsewhere and it's like, all right, we're good to go at this site for
Oh,
this
so
region?
I'm not doing the reintroduction. I'm not licensed to do that.
So it's more
I
of a
work with people that are licensed to do that. That's not me. I don't
okay,
reintroduce beavers. Like I don't
gotcha.
do that.
not not yet. I was wondering, like, yeah, do you breed the beavers? Like, where do you get
No,
them from?
no.
And uh,
Well, so they're nuisances. People are always trying to get rid of them. So it's not quote unquote difficult to get beavers. But I, like there's a lot of laws prohibiting the placement of beavers because of like giardia and different diseases that they carry. This is also another reason it's really nice working with tribes on this because they're not bogged down by the same regulations. So they're like, yeah, we'll relocate the beaver. You know what I mean? They're like so much more game to do a lot of this stuff that's just prohibitive at the state and federal level.
And it's also like you were saying, there's that respect for the beaver as well, like with their stories
Yeah,
and the history. And it's like this is a valued animal, and just like you were saying too,
yeah,
like, oh, can I get near the beaver? And every guy's like, listen, that's my water source right there. Don't you mess with that beaver.
yeah,
It's just like very,
yeah,
very like
basically.
aware and insightful of what's going on, which is really
Yeah, they're
cool.
like, don't mess with that beaver. I was like, I'm not. I'm just, I'm trying to learn from them, like respectfully. I'm not gonna interact. Uh, I don't know. Can you re-ask the question? I got
Well,
distracted by thinking about the beaver. Okay.
no, no,
So when
no.
you brought up the story, so there was a big grizzly bear that was at that field site that was living there. And for whatever reason, the way you asked that question reminded me of the giant grizzly bear that was hanging out at that beaver pond.
Did
And
you
I
have
got
to?
completely sidetracked.
Did you have to deal with said grizzly bear?
I mean, bears for the most part are pretty chill. I mean, if you just like don't vibe with, like, if you don't interact with them, they're not super interested in you.
Okay, so you weren't being chased by a bear as you were trying to measure beaver hydrodynamics, right?
I was not being chased by a bear. No. I mean, I encountered packs of wolves and moose and bears, and I just don't respond. I don't know. I don't interact.
One of the
I'm gonna
questions
go this way.
from the community, Jordan, is if you had unlimited funds and like you didn't have to deal with any kind of barriers, what is the dream experiment that you would do that you feel like would provide them for you the most amount of insight?
Oh, that's a good question. Like if I could just run it from scratch.
Like whatever you wanted,
Uh,
I'll give you the time, the money, you name it. What's that most interesting question that you haven't been able to do yet?
so one of the questions um, that I can't even, well, I'm attempting to answer it now with an, anyway, is the work distribution of beaver colonies. So one of the questions that I got asked was like, what beaver's doing what and how do they distribute work? I have no idea. I have, for somebody who studied beavers, I barely saw one during my entire field study, right? Like everything that I know has been inferred based on how they modified the landscape. And then also just reading a lot about people and working with people who work with beaver directly. Honestly, fur trappers were the most insightful. But the question that I would like to ask is how do they distribute work among the beaver colony? And so I'd like to GPS tag them and like let them loose in this environment and see how they're building. Um, I think that would be it if I for the beaver question. For the robotics question, so I'm not literally building a robot like a beaver. I'm building a suite of robotic tools that mimic what beavers can do. So I'm making an excavator robot. I'm making, that's like the first part. There's going to be like the navigation bit, which is through the drone imagery and the multi-agent simulation. Like this suite of robotic tools is trying to accomplish what a beaver can do. But like I said, we don't engineer like a beaver, so it's like multiple things. So it would be nice to be able to think about building out this suite and how we could modify it to cope with different environmental inputs for different environments like outside of riparian zones.
Yeah, so it's like I guess adapting is the dream goal for that robot would be like you can just program it and it goes off and does its thing. So it needs to be adapted for a particular ecosystem, like built
I mean,
for movement and excavating of that type of soil.
like it might even just be like adaptive management of like a cityscape, like a
Mhm.
waterway that's at the interface of a cityscape or something like that. Like having a robotic tooling framework that's able to like cope in real time with variations in like flow or variations. And it could even be like human traffic, right? We can get super esoteric with it, but like it's the same design framework. How do we think about the way beavers respond to the influxes and decreases, and can we like adaptively manage whether it's a robotic tool or an algorithm to manage landscapes in a way that is done with care, and in like also a way that's not going to kill everything around it. Like, can we build in such a way that we're not going to disrupt the, the flow of nutrients to the environment, that we still enable it? Like, there's so many questions there, and a lot of it gets esoteric and weird, but I guess that's why I'm looking at beavers, because that's what they do, and they do it really well.
The first part of what you kind of the dream result of like to figure out like how all the beaver behaviors work. We actually had a couple of questions from that earlier. My guess is that we don't know. Is there a sexual dimorphism in how the workload that they do and age effects to it? And is that something that in that dream experiment, is that something that you would want to know, or is that kind of outside the current scope, or is it just like the eventual maybe?
So I think I'd like to know it. But I also don't, I think it's one of those things that the answer is not going to be as nice as I think it is. Because, so I know a few beaver rehabbers. Like, I talk to all sorts of people. And some of the rehabbers have told me that they definitely distribute work. Like, there's one beaver that'll build the dam and another beaver goes and collects. Right? Like, they seem to specialize locally. And then, like, I have a bunch of anecdotal stories. Like, and like, so, and that's kind of the problem with beaver. It's not a problem. It's actually kind of maybe a feature, I guess, is the more you interact with beavers, the more you realize they have personalities. Like, and I know that's a weird thing to say, but like when you interact with termites, for instance, you don't necessarily think about them having personalities. And maybe it's just because they're such a different species, we can't relate. But like beavers, when you interact with, they definitely 100% have personalities. Like, they're not just these, as I have it framed, and I do frame it like this with my research, in fairness, is like I frame them as like these agents, like these that are just responding to cues within the environment and like somehow making an excellent decision. But that doesn't mean that there's any sense of optimization there. I mean, they're not machines, right? They are these rodents that are extremely social. They vocalize to each other, they talk to each other. They have different vocalizations. So they have, like, as far as I like roughly, I don't want to call it language, but they have different, like, they call each other things. They have different response, like they have different sounds they make. And if you pay attention to it, you can get like the way that a mother will talk to its kit, you can tell based on the vocalizations. Like, they have variations in how they communicate. They're highly social. They seem, just based on anecdotal work, they seem to, within the colony, specialize. But then what arises over many, many generations, I don't know. Like, I don't know how it would generalize out. I don't know how good that question is if you're only working on the scale of one colony. Like, I think if you're working on the scale of one colony, you're basically just going to see a highly social system with all of these really complex social dynamics. So anyway, I have a lot of anecdotes. People say to me, oh, like, young beavers are bad at building and they have to learn. Um, and I think both are true. Like, so so within the literature, beavers do have a genetic predisposition to build, which is to say that they will engage in building behavior without ever being taught to do so. Like, they won't, like, because they've separated kits from their parents, and these kits, without ever like interacting with an adult beaver, will engage in building behavior. So they do seem to have that drive. But at the same time, like, if you talk to any of these wildlife rehabbers or anybody that works very closely with beaver, they're like, oh yeah, they get better with experience, and they also get better when they're shown how to do things by adult beavers. So like, I think both are true, but I don't know. I don't know. I'm like, this is all anecdotal stuff, and that's kind of where I get.
Yeah. It sounds like chimp studies with like there's an innate preference to make tools, but they get better if they're shown, or even bugs, like insect studies too, have shown like there's an innate behavior to do this, but if they observe another one doing this, they get better, like with pollinators or even ants. So it's
Yeah.
yeah, it makes sense. It's that again, it comes back to this really complex social network, like the termites, like the ants, and on top of that, now you're overlaying a complex network of inlets, dams, you know, all of
Multiple
those
generations
yeah, it's
that don't even necessarily have to be related, right? It's just like
right, like you were saying, like we
coordination
move
across
back in.
colonies.
Yeah, it's like we move back in.
Yeah.
There was this remnants of a canal that probably introduces the idea that hey, was something good here. Let's go check it out. Like that's cross generational colony communication.
Yeah.
Like that's just so
Yeah.
incredibly cool. Um, again, probably we don't know this yet, but if there were like introductions to a new area for it to reseed a zone or like that nucleation event, does it need to be an originally empty area, or is it okay to nucleate if there's maybe one or two beavers already there, but not enough to actually restart the process?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so another application of this work, if I'm right, right, like, and I am testing this hypothesis actually. Like, I am going to field sites and starting to make fake canals to see if beavers will respond to them, like,
Oh,
so canal
cool.
mimicry, I guess. If I'm right, and I don't know if I am, this is just hypothesis, but if I am, it would be a really interesting restoration technique to like redirect beavers into areas where they're not going to be in conflict with humans, right? If we could somehow communicate with beavers in the way that they communicate through architecture, if I could leave a canal here and I would say, that would be saying to the beaver, build here. This is where we want you to build. Like that, that could be a way to coordinate and mitigate human beaver conflicts. And like also, and conversely, if we don't want them to build in a certain area, let's take those canals out. Like let's make it look as unattractive as possible.
And so with that, does that suggest there is like a genetic code for a certain type of building as well? Like this is attractive, this is not attractive, because presumably there's some variance in how they build in their methodology, like per group, but is it maybe not different enough where you can get like a given rule, or is it something we still just don't know?
I don't know. I have no idea. I couldn't tell. So like I don't know if they. So I mean, this gets into the idea of culture, like animal culture, and I don't. The thing is, I'm not convinced that that's happening. And then the reason I'm not convinced that's happening is because of how successful beavers have been in it. Like, I could take a beaver from the Great Plains, not that I would, but I could, and I could drop it off in, like, I don't know, Mississippi. And it's still going to engage in building behavior, but like what it builds is going to be different than like they like I said, it's like again, I view it like a conversation between environment and builder. Like it's very dynamic, and what emerges is a structure that is custom to the environment. I would be hesitant to call that culture, but like at the same time, I couldn't say anything that it's not. You know,
It makes it all the
I don't
more
know.
interesting, that complexity. It makes it all the more hard to study too, but all the more interesting that there are
Yeah.
those all those nuances. We actually had a question from another community
Mhm.
member. How do
Mhm.
you think your research was depicted in Beaverland?
Um. Hmm. Well, I like Leela quite a bit. I was pleased with it, for sure, with how she wrote it. I think it was accurate, especially at the time she interviewed me. Right. So in the time that she interviewed me, I hadn't gotten as far as I am now.
Hmm.
Like a lot of this work, a lot of this intellectual work and theorizing didn't happen until I was after that interview. And so for the time I was interviewed and what I was thinking at the time, I think it captures well what I was thinking, how I was thinking about the system.
And now with the all the new knowledge, we need a
I would
volume
def
two.
it would be a different with what I've learned now. And like oddly, like I wasn't the reason I think I have so much more now is after my PhD, and I don't want to get into the politics of going through a PhD program, like, and it was like, without getting into too much detail about it, I was really limited on who I could talk to because when you're working with academics, they're a little snot-nosed, or like, kind of like haughty. And a lot of my insights came when I had the freedom to talk to people who were beaver trappers, who were landscape, like people who worked with the actual animal. Like my insights didn't really manifest until I got to speak with the people who don't have the academic credentials, but have this really deep knowledge of working with the animal. And once I really started to engage with that community, I was able to really flesh out my ideas in a richer way. And I think in a way that's more grounded in beaver behavior.
I like that. One common theme, Jordan, that throughout our conversation tonight that's been coming up is the beauty of how you feel it's important to talk to people, right? Like your experiences in the academic circle versus what you do now with the experts who don't necessarily have a degree, but they're the expert, right, on this
They are,
type
yeah.
of piece. Could you just comment to us? I feel like the community is someone that would already gravitate towards this, but just to have your insight on the importance of talking to people and spreading that love of science and the knowledge base that you have and making it accessible.
Well, I'm really inspired when I talk to people about what they know, right? Because I come from like I think a really rigorous academic training, but I also come from rural Montana, like and I, it is a bit of code switching to be able to talk between the two, and one of the things. So I mean, like this is like a broader question with bigger themes in my life. So when I when I went to school for my PhD, which is crazy how much like space it takes up in my head. But when I went, one of the things I was known for was how well I could build things. Where people are like, "Oh, you need help building that? Ask Jordan how to do it. She knows how to machine. She knows how to design. She knows how to assemble. She knows how to build. She could build anything." And that like blew my mind that people would say that. But it's because I grew up with a cowboy, right? And who is a much better engineer or like builder than I am. And I build up. I grew up with all my cousins, and they can make anything work, right? And like next to them I look like a complete idiot, right? But like even what I consider like really kind of mediocre skills relatively were like blowing everybody else's minds in this like academic context for like how good I was at building things, which I'm not. Like, well, like I'm decent, but like not like the people who raised me, if you know what I mean, right? And so I think part of it is I respect them, which people can tell if you're cosplaying respect or if you actually do. Uh, so that there is this element of like, and I didn't arrive, like, and honestly, I didn't arrive at that until years in therapy, right? Like, it's like one of those things where it's just like, why don't they? Because they don't respect it, they don't value it, and like that was also another issue that I had in academic circles is a lot of this practical knowledge they view as beneath them to know. And like this gets on a completely different trajectory, but like I grew up on a cattle ranch. I mean that highly skilled, right? Extremely skilled, extremely knowledgeable on the business end, the animal welfare side, the landscape management side, the just the random things you have to do to get your tractor working, like just the breadth of stuff you have to do that's so random and just like and the skill sets you need and and then I went into this like elite ivory tower and like those people were looked down on or dismissed, and that but that's like so foundational to my knowledge set, right? And so there was this other side of it where in the hubris of youth I felt like I had something to prove, so I read everything I could read, and I did the academic thing to the best of my ability, and I made myself sick, and I just trying to like be this thing that I was never going to be. And then once I got out of there, I was actually able to make progress, which is kind of a sad story.
It's a common reoccurring theme, unfortunately. And like you said, you're almost primed by your past and your upbringing to be able to work hard and to be able to talk to people with respect, which unfortunately would have been beaten in you otherwise. That's not a worthwhile thing. I know it's something I talk to our community about. Like the world's expert on leafcutter ants does not have a PhD. He's just worked with ants since he was 12, and he's now in his
Yeah.
50s. And it's like, why don't we ask this guy who is the expert on how to keep them alive, for example? It's like, well, why would we do that, right?
Yeah.
It's the people who are experts, and not just that, Jordan. Like the way you talk to just non-experts, like here in this community with me about like the material science, the beaver science. It's never gets the vibe of like I'm better than you. It's like we having a conversation. I feel like that's just something that's sometimes lost when speaking to people.
Yeah, and that certainly happens in the academic community. And I think it, so I mean, one of the things I get asked about a lot, and you kind of alluded to it, is like, how are you so successful working with tribal communities? I've been trying for years and I keep getting run off. I'm like, I don't know, man. Have you just like tried talking to them like they're people? I don't know. Like, I have no idea what to tell you. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know.
I love that answer though. Of be like, look, man, just try being like a good person. Like,
Yeah,
that's
just
it.
like,
I, I mean, I
just
love
you're
that theme
talking to
though.
another person.
Yeah,
Like, I don't know.
like the theme of talking with respect, regardless of the background that the individual has, is just like, hey, we're bonding over to this knowledge, and it doesn't matter where you're coming from. It's we're bonding over knowledge. Like that should be enough, right? And I think
Yeah.
it's incredible that that's how you've led your research question and have been able to getting into like all these data sets and these stories that no one else has been able to tell. Like you said a year ago, you'd be like, I wouldn't even thought that this would have happened, and now I have that story, and that's a testament to you as a person and how you're running your science, which I think is should inspire and should be looked upon by many, many people.
Well, thanks. I appreciate you saying that. And I don't, and one of my peers told, like, I went to high school with them, and they're like, after you got out of your program, you were just so intense and you needed to calm down and you were defending everything. And I was like, well, because I was used to being attacked all the time. Like I was used to kind of always kind of engage in this battleground, and it was stupid. Anyway, but I got through the PhD. I didn't get any publications during my PhD, and I'm just submitting them all now. And again, that just took leaving it, which again is really sad to say. I don't know how to account for that. And I've had really fruitful conversations with other scientists that see the value of it, but I don't know what it was specifically about being in this overly prestigious PhD program that was just so inhibitive to actual work. I still don't understand it, and maybe never will, but there is something to be said for doing work within community that really adds it value, and it does capture the like beavers are very charismatic critters, and and people don't have beaver questions. Everybody has a beaver story. So like like that's another thing too, is just allowing other people to story tell at you, and that does a lot.
I feel like that's how the chat's been tonight too. Is if it's very much started off with like, oh, I had some beavers who were like digging up stuff, and then it very quickly as you started talking, be like, well, wait a minute, how does this thing work? How does this thing work? What about this beaver? What does this
Yeah,
beaver do? What do you mean the canals are
yeah,
expanding? What do you mean that there's and it's just like right, it just furthers and furthers and spins and snowballs to like really how important and how cool your research is.
yeah. Everybody has a beaver story.
So, Jordan, thank you again so much for your time tonight. I know we've gone over, we just had so many questions coming in, and just I
Yeah.
appreciate your time and insight and just answering all of our questions and telling your incredible research story. Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with? Any like cool beaver facts or beaver stories that we haven't touched on, or just like a last little bit of, you know,
Do I have
something for
any
this
beaver
evening?
facts? I have so many beaver facts. But no, I won't waste your time with that. I'm going to be in Scotland talking about beaver robots in September. So, yeah, I guess to my dad who said I wasn't going to get a job knowing being an expert in beavers, I'm giving an international talk.
Congratulations, you have your opening
Thank
line.
you. Yeah,
Is it
thank
opening
you.
line to take that, Dad?
Yeah, take it. Yeah, there you go.
What does a an
Uh,
international conference on beavers look like? Just out of curiosity.
yeah, yeah. So I'm back. I mean, I'm really pleased that I get to speak at this thing. It is a so there's two species of beaver. There's the Eurasian beaver and the North American beaver, and they're so genetically distinct they can't even breed with each other. They're different species, but they fill the same ecologic niche. I don't know what the differences are. Like there hasn't been a very robust study on behavioral differences other than like the Eurasian beaver is slightly larger than the North American beaver. And then somehow the North American beaver outcompetes the Eurasian beaver in the same habitat type. So I don't know why. But anyway, there's a massive restoration effort going on in Europe and increasingly Asia about bringing beavers back to address the same climate issues here in North America. And so people are reintroducing beavers all over Europe. And it is having a tremendous impact on the ecology over there. And there's suddenly a huge interest in this work and sharing knowledge and how can we do this? What can we learn? How can we manage these animals? how do we communicate to the public about why it is worthwhile to put beavers back on the landscape? Why is it worthwhile to implement policy where we're not building new buildings in, like, riparian wetlands? Like, why should we very intentionally make space for other species, and in particular the beaver? And like, part of it is this outsized impact it has. Like, it cools water, it cleans water, it sequesters carbon from the environment, it stores carbon, right? So it's actively pulling carbon from the atmosphere, it's storing carbon over the long term, they're widening wetlands, they're increasing biodiversity, they're making habitat for all of these other iconic species that, like, these countries like identify with, like these birds and like certain fish. Like, even if people don't love beavers, they often love the habitats that enable their favorite species. And then, also like the public health aspect of it, where you have these dams that are filtering out pesticides from the water, and they're cleaning the water and they're building up these nutrients, and they, when they fail, they inject massive amounts of nutrients downstream. So that's like another part about like beaver architecture I like, is that it's designed to fail. And like, we don't design things to fail, and it's kind of an oversight on our part, because like, we build these systems and they just last forever. And but like, beaver systems are designed to fail, and that's actually really healthy if you do it in the right way. And yeah, I mean, there's just a hugely renewed effort of trying to get these animals back on the landscape, to try to pull some carbon out of the atmosphere, to try to cool down our waters, bring more water to the surface, bring in all of these other species. Like, beavers in many ways are a climate hero. And so there's a huge effort in both Europe and North America trying to communicate to the general public of like, we really need to partner with this species. Like, this species, it can do it.
What is the main difficulty? Is it just that they're viewed as a pest, like in North America, where you're like, oh, I don't want it on my land?
Yeah, I mean, there's the discrimination, right, against the beaver. Like, they're aggressively discriminated against and trapped out of waterways. They flood people's homes. They'll, like, excavate burrows and canals into the sides of roads and railways and things like that. Like, they are a huge threat to human infrastructure. There's no question about it. And then they'll turn this perfectly managed stream into a marshy wetland that's like inaccessible to, like, oh, that was my favorite swimming spot. Now I got to wade through all this marsh to get to my favorite swimming spot, because there's all these new bugs and all these new, like, invertebrates, and it's gross, and it's not, it's not the easy thing that I thought, right? So there's that. But yeah, I mean, so there's the bias, there's how they undermine human infrastructure, but also, like, if you're a real estate developer, you want that, like, riverfront property to build your, like, apartment complex, but that's like the beaver zone, right? And like, God, forbid you give that space to a beaver. Like, no, like, I need to make, I need to build my apartment complex here, or my home here. And I think, so the Blackfeet tribe, for example, has instituted a policy where they will not allow people to build new structures in these wetlands, specifically to allow beavers to build in them. And like, those are the type of policy changes. And like, people don't like to be told you can't build your house in that, like, flood zone or in that wetland.
And I guess to the difficulty of time, right? Like you were saying, it's you don't just put in the beaver and it's immediately going to do its thing. You're talking about
No.
years and years of work. So in order to see
Yeah.
the benefits, you have to wait. And it's like we're not really
Yeah.
good at waiting anymore.
Oh, we're terrible. We're so terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and then we can't see it, right? We're like, well, that beaver took down my favorite tree, and I'm gonna shoot all of them. And people do that.
Well, on the plus side, Jordan, you're leading the fight to accept beavers and for them to hopefully stop that. Like, I feel like it's
I
these
am
kinds of
not.
conversations
I wouldn't
that can
call
help.
myself a leader. There are stronger, more aggressive leaders in this field than I am. I just happen to be a scientist. And I think one of the reasons a lot of my work is so compelling to people who've worked with beaver is I try to imagine the beaver's point of view.
That's a very apt way of putting it. Yeah. I feel like you have
Yeah.
to in order to understand any of the elements that you've outlined for us today.
Yeah, I try. I don't know how well I'm doing, but
Well, if chat is any indication of the 130 people who were here watching the interview, you're doing amazing. Like
okay.
you're doing incredible work.
I appreciate it. Thank you for all the questions.
Absolutely. And Jordan, thank you for your time today. I know calling in from Alaska as they're flying back to
Mhm.
Boston tomorrow. Have a very safe
Yeah.
trip. Good luck in Scotland. And the community is already saying if you ever want to come back on, and the same comes from me, just please let us know. We would love to have you on at any point. Even if there's a new paper comes out, or you just think, you know what? We didn't talk enough about this one thing. Let me just come back. I want to tell you all about this. We'd love to have you join us again. Like again, thank
Well, maybe in a couple years, because I'm up here trying to start some clam garden works with the Tlingit and Haida tribe. So we'll see how that goes.
We'll be here. Thank you so much
All
again,
right.
Jordan.
Sounds good.
Absolute pleasure.
Yeah.
Have a wonderful rest of your day and safe travels.
Science is for
Thank
everyone,
you.
all
Bye.
backgrounds, all ages, all genders, and all walks of life deserve an education. Come be one of us.